My name is Hannah Reyes. I am 31 years old. I buy and restore distressed commercial property for a living, and 3 days before my wedding, my mother canceled it to pay for my sisters. She didn't call it that. She called it a small adjustment. She called it what's best for the family right now. What it actually was, my mother took the deposit money my fiancé and I had given her to hold, because she'd insisted, because she was the mother, because that's what mothers do, and she moved it, along with our date and our vendors, to my sister Camille's wedding, which had been thrown together in 6 weeks and needed to happen fast, for reasons no one would quite explain to me. "You're so easygoing, Hannah," my mother said on the phone, 3 days out. "Camille's been under so much pressure. You two can just do something small later. You don't mind. You never mind." Behind me, my dress was hanging on the closet door. 110 people had RSVP'd. My fiancé, David, was on his way home not knowing yet that our wedding no longer existed. And my mother was right about one thing. I never minded. For 31 years I had been the daughter who didn't mind, who gave up the window seat, the bigger room, the last word, the spotlight, every single time, because minding was selfish and Camille was fragile and I was strong, and strong girls don't need things. But my mother had made one mistake, and she made it because she had never once in 31 years thought of me as a person who owned anything. She didn't know the venue was in my name. Before I tell you what happened when my mother arrived at that venue to set up my sister's wedding, and found out who actually held the deed, tell me what time it is where you are right now, and whether you've ever been the one who never minds. I want to see how far this story travels. I need to explain the venue, because it's the whole spine of this story, and it's the one thing my family never understood about me even while they were standing inside it. I buy buildings nobody else wants. That's the plain version of what I do. I find distressed commercial property, old mills, failed restaurants, a fire-damaged event hall, a bankrupt banquet space, and I buy it cheap, and I restore it, and I either sell it or I hold it and lease it. It is unglamorous, it is slow, and it requires a very specific temperament, patience, an eye for what a ruined thing could be, and an absolute refusal to overpay because you got emotional. My family never took it seriously. My mother told people I flipped houses, which I don't, and Camille told people I did something with real estate, in the tone you'd use for a distant cousin's vague job. 18 months before my wedding, I bought a fire-damaged event hall on the edge of town. It had been a beautiful place once, high ceilings, tall arched windows, a garden that had gone to seed. A kitchen fire had closed it 2 years earlier and the owners couldn't afford to rebuild, so I bought it for less than the land was worth, through the holding company I use for everything, a company with a bland name that has nothing to do with mine on the surface. Reyes Restoration Holdings, but it trades under a different operating name, because that's how these things are structured. I spent a year restoring that hall, and I did most of the deciding myself, alone, at night, after the crews went home. I chose the paint by holding samples up to the arched windows at 4 different times of day. I saved the original garden wall when everyone told me to knock it down. I found a local ironworker to rebuild the railings by hand because the replacements looked like nothing. Nobody in my family saw any of it. Not once in that entire year did my mother or my sister ask to come see the building I was pouring myself into, because in the family story, my work was a vague thing I did with real estate, not a place a person could stand inside and feel something. The night I finished it, I stood alone in the empty hall under those windows, and I thought, without letting myself say it out loud even to David yet, this is where I'll get married. I did it partly as an investment and partly, honestly, as a love letter to myself, because somewhere in the back of my mind I had thought, this is where I'll get married. I didn't tell my family that. I'd learned a long time ago not to hand my family the things I loved, because they had a way of picking them up, examining them, and either breaking them or deciding they belonged to Camille. When David proposed, I did tell them the wedding would be at a restored event hall on Miller Road. I gave them the operating name, the public name, the name on the website. I did not say I owned it. I said we'd gotten a good rate, which my mother took to mean I'd found a bargain, and she was pleased, because a bargain was the kind of thing she expected from her practical, easygoing daughter who never minded. So here is the situation my mother walked into, without knowing it. The venue where my wedding was booked, the venue she was about to cancel my wedding at and hand to my sister, was owned, in full, by me. She thought she was moving a booking. She was about to try to evict the landlord from her own building. Let me tell you about being the one who never minds, because you can't understand the ending without it. Camille is 2 years younger than me, and from the time we were small, the family organized itself around a single principle: Camille feels things more. She was the sensitive one, the dramatic one, the one whose feelings could fill a house. And I was the one who could absorb it, who could be reasoned with, redirected, asked to give a little more so that Camille wouldn't come apart. It started small and it never stopped. Camille wanted my birthday party's theme, so I gave it to her, and I was praised for being generous. Camille wanted the college I'd been accepted to, applied late, got in, and my mother suggested I go somewhere else so the girls wouldn't compete, and I did, and I was praised for being mature. At 26 I planned a trip I'd saved 2 years for, and Camille announced a breakup the week before, and my mother asked how I could think of leaving while my sister was hurting, and I canceled it, and lost the deposit, and was praised for being a good sister. When I got my first real profit from a property, Camille had a crisis that same month, and my mother asked if I could help, and I did, and it became a pattern. My successes became a fund that my sister's emergencies drew down, and everyone treated this as the natural order, water flowing downhill, strong to fragile. I want to be fair, because fairness is the whole point. Camille was not a monster. She had genuinely learned, from the time she was a child, that falling apart got her taken care of, and that I would always be there to absorb the cost. She didn't experience herself as taking from me. She experienced herself as being loved correctly, finally, and me as simply not needing what she needed. My mother built that. My mother spent 31 years teaching one daughter that her feelings were emergencies and the other that her feelings were luxuries she was too strong to indulge. The cruelest part wasn't any single sacrifice. It was that I came to believe it about myself. I really did think I was the one who didn't mind. I had a whole identity built on it. Hannah's so easygoing, Hannah's so low maintenance, Hannah doesn't need a fuss. I had made myself small so consistently that I'd forgotten it was a shape I'd been pressed into, not a shape I'd chosen. It felt like humility. It was actually just a very well-decorated cage. I found the edges of that cage 3 days before my wedding. The call came on a Tuesday. The wedding was Saturday. My mother's voice had the particular warmth she used when she was about to ask me to give something up, the honey she poured over the ask so that refusing it would feel like cruelty. She told me Camille and her fiancé Ryan needed to move their wedding up. She was vague about why. She said there were reasons. She said, you know how these things are, she said it in the tone that meant I was not supposed to ask, and for 31 years I hadn't asked, because asking was minding, and I never minded. She told me that the simplest thing, the thing that made the most sense, the thing that would help the whole family, was for Camille to have Saturday. My Saturday. My venue, my vendors, the caterer I'd booked, the florist, the date on 110 invitations. And for David and me to do something small later. She had already, she informed me, spoken to the caterer and the florist about switching the event over. She had used the deposit money we'd given her to hold, she framed this as efficiency, as her taking care of things, to secure Camille's date at the venue. I asked her why Camille couldn't have a different Saturday. Any other Saturday. And my mother said, because this is the venue Camille wants. She saw the pictures. She cried, Hannah. You know how she gets. And you two picked it so casually, you don't even care about it the way she does. You never mind. I remember the silence on the line. My mother thought it was acquiescence. She'd heard that silence from me 1,000 times, and it had always meant yes. She thought I was doing the thing I always did, swallowing it, reorganizing my own life around Camille's need, getting ready to be praised for how well I took it. What was actually happening in that silence was very different. I was a commercial property owner, listening to my mother tell me she had secured a date at a venue she did not know I owned, using a deposit for a booking that, legally, ran through my own company. And I was realizing, slowly and then all at once, that for the first time in my life the thing my family wanted to take from me was a thing I actually, provably, held. I did not tell her. That's the part one want you to notice. Everything in my training screamed at me to explain, to protest, to make my case, to try to talk my mother out of it, to fight the way I'd always lost, with feelings, on her terrain, where Camille's tears would always outweigh my facts. I didn't. I said, quietly, okay, Mom. Let me look at my calendar. And I hung up. Then I called my lawyer. And then I called my fiancé, and I told David everything, the venue, what I owned, what my mother had just done, and what I was thinking. And David, who is a good man and had watched my family do this to me for 3 years, said the sentence that made me love him more than the proposal had. He said, Hannah, you don't have to win the argument. You just have to be the landlord. Here is what I did over the next 3 days, and here is what I did not do. I did not call my mother back to fight. I did not call Camille. I did not post anything, or rally relatives, or send a single wounded text. I did not give my family the emotional battlefield they had beaten me on for 31 years. What I did was act like exactly what I was, the owner of a building. My lawyer confirmed in an hour what I already knew. My family had no booking. The deposit my mother had given to the venue's event coordinator, who worked for me, though she didn't broadcast it and my family had no idea, had been for my wedding, David's and mine, under our contract. My mother had no authority to transfer it, reassign it, or book anything. She had spoken to my caterer and my florist as though she could move them, but the contracts with them were mine too, in my name, signed by me. She had, in her certainty, arranged an entire wedding out of things she did not own and could not give. So I made a few quiet calls. I confirmed with my caterer and florist that the Saturday event was proceeding exactly as contracted, my event, David's and mine, unchanged. I let the venue coordinator know that if anyone arrived to set up a different wedding, she was to be polite and firm, and to refer them to the owner. And then I did the hardest and most important thing, the thing that took real discipline. I said nothing to my family, and I let my mother keep believing she had one. For 3 days, my mother told relatives that Camille's wedding was on. She told them the venue, my venue, as though it were a thing she'd arranged. Camille posted about her dream venue, using photos from the website, photos of a hall I'd rebuilt with my own money and a year of my own patience. The moment I saw it I just knew, she wrote under a picture of the arched windows I'd chosen the glass for. Relatives commented that it was so perfectly her. I watched my sister call my restoration her dream, and accept congratulations for a taste she didn't know was mine, standing in a room she didn't know I owned, and I said nothing. I put my phone face down on the counter and I let her have the comments, because I already had the deed, and I was learning the difference between the two. I want to be honest about how that felt, because it wasn't triumphant. It was grief. Every hour I stayed quiet, I understood a little more clearly that my family was capable of erasing my entire wedding without a flicker of doubt that I'd object. That their certainty I wouldn't mind was so total that my mother had bet a 110-person event on it. That's not a person overlooking you occasionally. That's a person who has genuinely never once considered that you have a center of your own. David asked me, the night before, if I was sure I didn't just want to call my mother and tell her plainly, spare everyone the scene. And I thought about it. But I'd spent 31 years telling my mother plainly, quietly, reasonably, and it had never once worked, because on the terrain of family feeling I always lost. This was the first time in my life the facts were on my side and the ground was mine, literally, deed and title, mine. I wasn't going to move the fight back onto her terrain by warning her. Not out of cruelty. Because a boundary you announce in advance to someone who has spent 3 decades steamrolling your boundaries just gives them 3 days to steamroll it too. So Saturday came. And 2 weddings believed they were happening at the same building. Only one of them had the deed. My mother arrived at the venue at 9 in the morning to set up Camille's wedding. I was already there. Not dressed as a bride yet, that would come later, because my wedding, David's and mine, was still on for that evening, exactly as contracted. I was there as the owner, in the office off the main hall, doing what an owner does on an event day. I heard my mother in the lobby before I saw her. That bright, managing voice, telling the coordinator where the flowers should go, instructing my staff about my building. The coordinator, bless her, followed her exact instructions from me. She was polite, she was calm, and she said, I'm sorry, ma'am, but there's no event booked under that name today. The hall is booked this evening for the Reyes wedding. My mother laughed. She explained, the way you explain to someone slow, that she was Mrs. Reyes, that this was the family wedding, that there'd been a change, that Hannah had given the date to Camille. The coordinator said, again, that the only contract for that day was for Hannah Reyes and David, and that any change would have to come from the owner. And my mother, getting sharp now, said, then let me speak to the owner. Right now. The coordinator came to the office and told me my mother would like to speak to the owner. And I stood up, and I smoothed my shirt, and I walked out into the lobby of the building I had rebuilt, and my mother saw me and said, oh, Hannah, good, you're here. Can you tell this woman that? And I said, Mom, I'm the owner. She didn't understand it. I watched her try to fit it into a shape she recognized and fail. She said, the owner of what? I said, the building. This building. I own it. I bought it 18 months ago and I spent a year restoring it. There is no booking for Camille's wedding because I never made one, and you can't move my wedding, because the venue, the caterer, and the florist are all under contracts in my name. You didn't book anything, Mom. You told people a story about a thing you thought I'd give you. But this one was never yours to take. I did not raise my voice. I want you to understand that. My whole life the fights with my mother were loud on her side and pleading on mine, and I had learned that the person who is emotional is the person the room gets to dismiss. So I was quiet. I was quiet the way you can only be when you are standing on ground that is actually, legally, yours. My mother went through the stages fast. First, disbelief. This had to be a mistake, a coincidence of names. Then, when the coordinator confirmed it, a flash of something that looked almost like fear, because my mother's entire understanding of her family had just cracked. The daughter who never minded not only minded, she'd been holding the ground under everyone's feet the whole time. And then, predictably, she reached for the only tool she'd ever needed. She made it about Camille. Your sister's guests are arriving in a few hours, she said. 100 people. What am I supposed to tell them? You'd humiliate your sister like this? On her wedding day? And there it was, one last time, the machine that had run my whole life. Camille's need, wielded as a weapon. My mother wasn't asking whether what she'd done was wrong. She wasn't registering that she'd tried to cancel my wedding. Her instinct, standing in the wreckage of a thing she'd broken, was to make Camille's crisis my responsibility to solve, the way it had always been. I said, Mom, I didn't invite 100 people to a wedding here today. You did. Using a building you don't own and a date you don't hold. If 100 people are about to arrive somewhere there's no wedding, that's not a thing I did to Camille. That's a thing you did, betting on a daughter who you were sure would never mind. She said, so you're doing this for revenge. And I said the sentence I'd say again exactly the same way. I said, no, Mom. I'm not doing anything. I'm just the first thing in this family you couldn't move. Here's what I chose, and it wasn't what my family expected, and it probably isn't what you'd expect either. I could have let it burn. I could have stood there and let 100 of Camille's guests arrive to no wedding, let the whole thing collapse in exactly the public humiliation my mother had been so willing to inflict on me 3 days earlier. There would have been a kind of justice in it. My lawyer had told me plainly that I was under no obligation to host anyone, that the building was mine, that I could simply have my own wedding that evening and let my family's fiction dissolve on its own. But I kept asking myself what I actually wanted, underneath the anger, and it wasn't 100 strangers standing in a parking lot. It wasn't even Camille's humiliation. What I wanted, under everything, was to stop being moved. To stop being the thing the family reorganized around Camille's needs. I could have that without burning my sister to the ground, and burning her to the ground was a separate craving, and I was finally old enough to tell a craving from a need. So I offered my mother terms, right there in the lobby, calmly, with the coordinator as witness. I said, my wedding happens tonight, as contracted. That is not negotiable and it was never in question. But the hall is empty during the day. If Camille wants to be married here this morning, a small ceremony, her 100 guests, in the building I own, she can. As my guest. Because I choose to offer it, as the owner, not because it was taken from me. And in exchange, 3 things become true, starting now. 1. Everyone in this family finds out, today, that I own this building and that I restored it. The story where Hannah found a good rate ends. My mother tells the truth about whose venue everyone is standing in, out loud, to the family. 2. The deposit money, mine and David's, that my mother moved, comes back to me in full, and my mother never again holds, moves, or secures a single dollar of mine. 3. This is the last time. The last time a crisis of Camille's is solved by taking something of mine. My mother says it, out loud, and she means it, or Camille finds another building this morning. My mother stared at me. She said, "You'd make me say all that? In front of everyone?" And I said, "You were going to make me disappear my own wedding in front of everyone. I'm offering you your daughter's ceremony in a building I own. Say the words, or don't. It's genuinely your choice. For the first time, it's actually your choice and not mine." She said the words. It cost her something I'd never seen it cost her, that public correction, in front of arriving relatives, admitting that the venue was mine, that I'd built it, that she'd tried to take my wedding and been stopped not by an argument but by a deed. Camille was married that morning, in my hall, as my guest, and she cried through the whole thing, and I genuinely don't know how much of it she understood even then. And that evening, in the same hall, under the same restored arched windows, David and I were married. My 110 guests came. My caterer served the meal I'd chosen months earlier, in the room I'd chosen the paint for by holding samples up to those windows at 4 different times of day. My florist filled the space I'd rebuilt railing by railing. At some point during the first dance I looked up at the arched windows I'd saved when everyone said to replace them, and I understood that I was standing inside the one thing I had ever made purely for myself and refused to give away. My family had spent 31 years teaching me that wanting something for myself was selfish. And here I was, married in the proof that it wasn't. It was the most honest thing I had ever done, because it was the one thing my family couldn't move. The 18 months after that were not dramatic. That's the part these stories never show. Camille and I are not close, but we are, strangely, more honest than we've ever been. A few months after the weddings, she came to see me, and she said the thing that told me she'd understood more than I thought. She said, "I never knew you wanted anything. Mom always said you didn't." And I said, "I know." That was the whole system. And Camille was quiet, and then she said, "I think I liked it. That you didn't seem to want things. It meant there was always more for me." That was the most honest thing my sister had ever said to me, and it wasn't an apology, but it was true, and I've come to value true over sorry. Camille started, slowly, doing her own version of the work, going to a therapist, learning that a feeling isn't an emergency, learning that being taken care of and being loved are not the same transaction. She has a long way to go. But she stopped treating my life as a fund she could draw on, and the first time she had a crisis and didn't call me to solve it, I almost cried, because it was the first evidence in 31 years that the machine could actually be turned off. My father surprised me. He'd been a bystander my whole life, the way passive parents are, present, pleasant, and utterly unwilling to intervene while my mother ran the family. A few weeks after the wedding he came to the hall, alone, and he walked around it slowly, looking up at the windows, and he said, "You did all this. And we never even asked to see it." And I said no, they never had. And he said, "I should have asked. About a lot of things. It wasn't much. But it was the first time my father had ever named his own silence, and I decided to let it count, because he's old and I'm tired of waiting for cleaner sentences than people can make. My mother took the longest, and I want to be honest that with her it's still unfinished. For months she told relatives that I'd ambushed the family, that I'd hidden the truth to embarrass everyone, that a loving daughter would have just given Camille the date. The version where I was the cold one fit the family she'd spent 31 years building. Then, about 7 months later, she came to the hall on a quiet afternoon. She'd never come just to see it. She stood in the middle of the empty room, under the windows, and for a long time she didn't say anything. Then she said, "I want to say something, and I don't want you to make it easy for me." She said, "I spent your whole life telling everyone you didn't mind. I told you so often that you believed it, and then I believed it, and then I built everything on it. I never once asked if it was true. It was just so convenient that you didn't need anything. I'm sorry." She didn't ask me to forgive her. That's the only reason it landed. It was the first thing my mother had ever said to me that didn't have an instruction folded inside it. I told her it would take time. She said she knew. She comes to the hall sometimes now, on quiet afternoons. She stopped saying "I never mind." She finally understands what those words were doing, and what they cost the daughter she said them about. People ask me whether it was revenge. I didn't cancel anyone's wedding. I didn't move a deposit that wasn't mine, or take a date that belonged to someone else, or bet a 100-person event on a person I was sure would never object. I didn't do a single one of the things that made the consequences arrive. My mother did all of that, in 3 days, certain to her bones that I wouldn't mind. All I did, on the most important Saturday of my life, was stop being movable. I stood on the one piece of ground my family couldn't reorganize around Camille, and it turned out that piece of ground was mine because I'd bought it, and paid for it, and rebuilt it, while they weren't paying attention. Here is what everybody lost. My mother lost the machine, the 31-year system where one daughter's needs were emergencies and the others were luxuries, and the strong one could always be moved. She lost it in the lobby of a building she didn't know I owned, when the daughter who never minded turned out to be the landlord. And she's the only one who has, eventually, done anything honest with the loss. Camille lost the fund. She lost the certainty that when she fell, I'd be underneath. And it turned out that losing that was the beginning of her actually growing up, which is not a thing I did for her, but is a thing that happened once I stopped absorbing her. And I lost something too, and it wasn't my family. I lost the belief that if I was easygoing enough, and low maintenance enough, and gave enough away for long enough, my family would eventually notice me and decide I mattered. I waited 31 years for that. It never came from being small. It came the day I finally stood on something I owned and refused to be moved off it. The hall did something else, too, that I didn't expect. Word got around, not about the family drama, that stayed private, but about the restoration itself, and other couples started booking it, and then a small design magazine ran a piece on the before and after, with my name on it, as the owner and restorer. For the first time, the thing my family had waved off as something with real estate had my name attached to it in print, described as what it actually was. My mother saw that article before she ever apologized. I think it was part of why she finally did. I keep the deed to that hall framed in the office now. Not the wedding photos, the deed. Because the deed is the thing that was actually real. My family could dispute a feeling, override an argument, outvote a preference. They could not argue with a title. There is something clarifying about finally having a boundary that doesn't depend on anyone agreeing it's valid. When I remember that Saturday now, I don't remember my mother's face in the lobby first. I remember David the night before, saying, "You don't have to win the argument. You just have to be the landlord." 31 years I'd tried to win the argument. I never could. I didn't need to. I just needed to own the ground. They spent my whole life telling me I never minded. It turned out I minded very much. I just also happened to own the building they tried to prove it in. So if there's someone in your life who keeps moving you, who's so certain you won't mind that they'll rearrange your entire life around someone else's needs, ask yourself one thing tonight. Do you actually not mind? Or have you just never once been standing on ground they couldn't move you off of? Thank you for staying with this story to the end. Every character and event in it is fictional, written for reflection and entertainment. But if any of it felt familiar, I hope it leaves you with this: the people who are sure you'll never mind have usually never given you anything solid enough to stand on. So build it yourself, quietly, while they're not looking. And the day they try to move you off it, you won't have to raise your voice. You'll just have to own the ground.